and especially us teachers. So thank you for hearing me out on that.
Thank you, John. We did have one other item with the funding strategy discussion, so we aren't going to move forward on the agenda just as yet. And I'd like to turn this over to Michael. We have in front of us a proposal that he has been thinking about that he'd like to bring before us, so I'll turn that over to him to discuss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In follow-up, in looking at the funding issues with the plan, it occurred to me that that one of the tools that I think that this board needs and the staff and would benefit us greatly is a more granular approach to measuring and presenting the funding status of the plan. And in that regard, I'd like to request that the Board of Trustees commission CalSTRS outside actuaries to study whether an alternative method of measuring and presenting the funding status of the defined benefit portion of the CalSTRS plan is available or appropriate for our purposes. Essentially, I'm looking to our actuaries to help us create a methodology that takes a more granular look at the funding status of the plan. And I think that this would be an additional tool in our toolbox that would help us analyze and create strategies that would foster this very discussion that we're talking about. I have had discussions with the staff in Milliman about some of the things that I think it should this method should look like, but I am hoping that our actuaries would actually give us some recommendations as to what that approach would look like. In that regard, I have presented to, I sent an email to the chair, and the copies of that email have been circulated to each member of the board, which email presents in more detail, at least my vision of what that might look like, but it is by no means is something that I am insisting that be out there, but as just a template against which Milliman can start their analysis and bring us back a recommendation. My understanding is that Milliman has presented an estimate to the staff for what that would cost. I believe the amount is about $25,000. So and I think that if we do this, it would simply improve the ability of the staff and this board and our actuaries to better analyze the issues that have come before this board.
You have the proposal in front of you. I'll give you a few minutes to read it over. Jack, Ed, do either one of you have any comments?
No, we
And-
talked it through to make sure we understood how to do the calculation, and Nick was on the phone with
Nick's-
us, and I
Right,
think
and
we
Nick's here
understand
if
it.
we have any questions about it.
Yeah.
Or where we might want to progress.
Yeah, I think it's your,
This was, I wanted the board to be able to take a look at this and decide as a whole, you know, is that something we see of as value to our whole conversation on it, and whether we would move forward with it or not, instead of just going ahead on it. So, Ian, you said, looked like you had something that you wanted to say.
This on? As Michael well knows, in order for the board to agree to spend assets on anything, studies or anything else, the expenditure is required to be necessary and appropriate. So I would appreciate it from my perspective if Michael will be a little bit more specific about how exactly this would help the board and staff further understand the funding status of the plan. Because I frankly, when I read it, I really was having a difficult time.
In the last meeting, we talked about the funding status of the plan and the possibility of increasing contributions and where those contributions will come from. There was some discussion about contributions from members being allocated to the benefit of others, and it occurred to me that that is based on an analysis that allocates contributions in a way that is different than you see in other circumstances. Specifically, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation has a way of allocating assets and analyzing the underfunding of a plan that is different than this. And what I am looking for is Milliman to come back and basically explore the question of whether this, using a different sort of allocation method, would be beneficial to the to our analysis of the funding strategies. Right now, we look at the underfunded nature of the plan as a whole, looking at all participants and beneficiaries as a group, whereas what you see, what can be done is something that breaks out the participants and beneficiaries into various groups and allocates the assets to the benefits in a way that is more granular and may in fact better inform how the funding structure, how funding will affect, how contributions will affect the future funding of the plan. I think that it's, to me, this is the difference between an X-ray and an MRI. It is more information that I believe will be useful in terms of fine-tuning how this plan is funded on the future, on a going forward basis. I think the $25,000 that has been asked is more than reasonable for them to bring us back an approach. I'm not suggesting that this is anything that we would necessarily, that would replace the way we report our underfunding, but be a tool that on an internal basis we can use to more fine-tune the impacts of various funding strategies. As we know, we're in a depletion right now. We're taking in less money than we need to maintain the current funding status of the plan. This would, I think, allow us to take a more, again, granular look, I hate to keep using that term, at exactly why that is, where that money's going, how the money is coming in, from where it's coming, and for whose benefit these contributions are being made. If we find that this tool is not beneficial, then fine, but I think as a board, given that we are the largest teacher-based fund in the country, the fact that we do have the expertise that we have, and the fact that people look to us because of our expertise and our understanding of this, that we owe it to ourselves to make sure that we have all the tools that are available to us to analyze what we have.
But, I mean, can you give me an example? I mean, for example, what could Milliman possibly come up with in this study that would potentially change the way the board or staff view the funding of the system?
For example, right now, we use the discount rate for all the benefits under the plan. That discount rate is based on the likelihood of getting a certain return over a 20-year period, and that makes sense for the plan as a whole. If you break down the beneficiaries by category, those participants who are in pay status right now, does that discount rate make sense for them? We should be using a different discount rate for them because, in fact, the assets that are available to pay their benefits don't have that 20-year horizon. And so does that, is in actuality, the present value of the benefit for those individuals larger than the present value of the benefit for an individual, not just larger, but should be measured differently than the present value of a benefit of a participant who is starting today, so that we have I think that if you did that, you would find that the numbers are going to be a little bit different, and maybe the way that we look at how we fund and some of the the pressures on that funding and on our investment strategy may be a little bit different. But we don't know if we don't look at it. If we look at it and it turns out that it's not useful, then that's fine. But I am, and if these structures weren't out there and available to defined benefit plans generally, then I wouldn't be asking this. But this is something that is used in the defined benefit world, but that we have not looked at all. And I'm concerned that it is something that we haven't even looked at. To the extent that we look at it, decide that it is not useful, that's fine. But But as a fiduciary, I feel that it's important that we at least identify and take a look to see what this would result. If you're, if looking at our liabilities and the allocation of assets to those liabilities in a more granular fashion doesn't yield any additional benefit to us in terms of our ability to analyze the funding structure of this plan, then so be it. But right now, we haven't even examined that possibility. We're not reinventing the wheel here, which is important in this regard. We're using I'm suggesting that we use as a template a structure that is already in place and has already been used for decades by the federal government in this context. So it shouldn't be something that should be difficult to put together, difficult to analyze, and see if it's beneficial to us.
Well, I mean, to my knowledge, it is true that the PBGC uses this for terminating plans, but I'm not aware of any plan, at least none that I represent, that have ever used that approach with ongoing plans or have, asked the actuaries to take a look at different categories of members. I just don't see, so if Milliman comes back and concludes that there's a difference between the different categories, would the board then be asked to consider setting up separate accounts, separate trusts to cover the different groups, or and have a separate discount rate for different groups? I mean, that's what I don't understand. I'm not against information. I'm the fiduciary counsel, but I'm in favor of useful information, and I just have a hard time seeing where this is useful.
Here's why I think it's useful, and here's where the similarities between our structure and what the PBGC sees in their terminated plans are the same. Because we are in a situation where the state guarantees the benefit. When we go through these charts that we looked at, we talked about a situation where the funds are depleted. When the funds are depleted, that doesn't mean that benefits are not going to be paid. That means that the state's guarantee kicks in, and the state is obligated to pay those benefits on a pay-as-you-go basis. And so I'm talking about using a structure that a guarantor has found useful in their analysis of the guarantees that they're responsible for, and potentially applying it to our situation where the state, as the guarantor, should be aware of the benefits that they are responsible for guaranteeing. I submit to you that it is possible that under a reasonable analysis using this structure, that some of the benefits for current retirees are less than fully funded. And that the contributions that the state is making right now are effectively guarantee payments. And I think that that's useful information that we should have, that we cannot determine using the current structure that we have.
Have the actuaries weighed in on this? And have,
I'd like to hear from Nick.
yeah.
Do you mind commenting?
Come on up, Nick. I do have a list, Terry, Jennifer, and Mike,
Oh,
and then,
maybe on the.
Sure.
So-
and then Nick will come back to you. So I can give you some time to think about what you might want to say.
Okay.
All right, Gary?
Actually, I was going to raise the same issue I think that Ian did towards the end of his comments or questions, and that is that I think this more granular analysis could be useful to the guarantor to the extent there is one, because basically I think that's what the PHB's Pension Guarantee Corporation looks at relative to termination alternatives for a plan, which again, I don't think is necessarily what we're looking at, but from a granular perspective, that's what possibly a guarantor might be interested in. Whether this board should, spend that money on that, 25,000 isn't a huge amount in relation to a lot of other things that we spend money for useful information. And from that perspective, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. It's the type of information that is somewhat in the public domain already relative to using different discount rates, and you could just allocate those liabilities towards different classes of members or future members. But basically, I think it's an issue related to termination, as Ian commented on at the end. That's all.
And as I said, it's an issue related to termination for the PBGC only because their guarantee doesn't kick in unless and until the plan is terminated. For this plan, the state is a guarantor without regard to termination.
Yeah, I guess I lean towards not supporting this. I think necessary and useful are different to me, and when Ian talks about necessary and appropriate, I think a lot of things could be useful. Is this necessary to help us make a decision? I don't feel it's necessary. So I think that was sort of my litmus test: is it necessary and appropriate? I think, I know we talked about this before, Michael, in the last conversation on the board around, to me, especially this year, I feel like our staff, we have a focus this year. And I guess I'm sensitive to, even with Milliman, the time and energy that we're kind of focused on and kind of the tasks that we have before us this year. And I guess I just don't support spending time on something that might be interesting or could be useful or not, but isn't necessarily necessary or appropriate for us to make decisions this year. So I wouldn't support us moving forward with this. So.
Sure.
The specific impetus for my request came in connection with a statement that was presented at the last meeting that said that increased contributions by new members would be perceived as being used to pay benefits for services that they didn't perform. And I understood that that was clearly a perception that a person would have given the underfunding of this plan. But the fact is that is not a necessary conclusion. And whether that conclusion is quote unquote true or not depends upon how we allocate contributions made by participants. And what surprised me was that we didn't have an alternative allocation template that allowed us to say to that participant, no, your contributions are being used to fund your benefit. And to the extent, and that is because this is the way in which we, on an accounting basis, not setting up different plans, but just on an accounting basis, this is how we account for contributions that come in. And given the fact that there is a structure that does that, because of the PBGC template, I know that there is a way to do that is a response to that quote unquote perception. But we hadn't done that analysis. We don't have that as a tool in our toolbox. And I think that from the perspective of making our case to participants and beneficiaries, I think it's important that we let them know that the way we that their contributions, the increase in contributions is not designed so that they will pay somebody else's benefit, but is intended to reduce the likelihood that their benefit will be underfunded. And those are two different things that right now, we don't have the tools in our toolbox to actually say to them. And we don't, and so, you know, listen, if in fact, what we want to say to them is what was stated in that statement, as the official position of this board, that's fine, but I want everyone on this board to understand that from my perspective, that is not the only way to analyze what is being done, how the contributions are being allocated, what benefits are funded, what benefits are not funded. And all I'm asking Milliman to do is give us an alternative way, demonstrate to this board an alternative way to analyze the funding status of this plan.
I just think you and I are going to disagree. That I feel like what you're doing is you're looking at CalSTRS and saying it's like a terminated plan or like a private
No,
entity plan.
it's
And I feel like that's what you and I had issues with last time.
and all I'm suggesting is that we get a report back from our actuaries. If what we get back from them is not useful, then fine. Yeah.
Rich?
You know, as a generic rule, I think more information is better than less information. So there's some attractiveness to this. On the other hand, Michael, I don't really understand, given the kind of system we have, the value of dividing up our potential recipients into various categories. There are a whole bunch of other categories where people don't collect in an equitable way. Men versus women, right? Age at which you retire. And we have a collective system that assumes that we've got strength by putting all these people in that system together. And I don't know that dividing up newcomers from old-timers is a place we're gonna wanna go, even if we had that information. So, although as an item of curiosity, I suppose it doesn't bother me. But if the implication is that we may in fact want to wander down that path, because the logical conclusion of that is each person in the system gets his or her own piece, and we're no longer a collective system that operates vaguely as an insurance policy for people. Some people are going to live longer. Some people are going to live shorter. They're going to collect different amounts of money. We sort of collectively account for that. The system is built in part on the fact that new people are coming in and are paying the current responsibilities of those in the system. So I don't find that strange. It's the kind of system we've developed. And I'm a little reluctant to open up a conversation that wanders away from that system. I believe in that system, I guess, and if the goal is to find a way to wander away, then that makes me anxious.
All right, I have Paul, then Jennifer, and then I'd like to go to Nick, because now questions are being raised that definitely we need to have your input on. Paul?
Yeah, I go back to where Michael started from, which is his concern about the statement that increasing future member contribution rates has future members paying shortfall for service they didn't perform. And I believe that a DB program, that is what may happen, because in a DB program, what happens is that people don't necessarily get out just what they pay in. Some people have maybe made contributions, or others on their behalf have made contributions more than would have been necessary for what they get out, and others less than what was necessary to get out. So this statement, which Michael takes issue with, I take issue with too, because I think it moves us into thinking of this more as a plan where everybody has their own separately funded account. They have only the responsibility to pay for their own separately funded account, and they only get out what was put into their separate account. And I think that's inconsistent. I think it's complex at CalSTRS because of the fact that our contributions are so unrelated to our needs. I mean, we're not making either normal contributions, we're not making contributions based on a calculation of what our normal cost is and what our amortization of the unfunded liability is, except for new members under PEPRA. So most other pension funds that I'm aware of, and correct me if I'm wrong because there are people here who know more about other pension funds than I do, but that other pension funds most of them make a calculation as to what the normal cost is and what the unfunded liability is and what needs to be paid into the system to amortize that unfunded liability. And then many, maybe not all, allocate that responsibility to pay the unfunded liability among all active members. And some of that unfunded liability may relate to people who are no longer contributing because they're retired and they're collecting money. But that's the way a DB program works. So I share with Michael a concern about starting to perceive this system differently, which I think we can't get to pure fairness when, as Rich says, some people live longer, some people don't live as long, some people, you know, it's not completely in relationship. There's not what you put in, what you get out. I'm not sure I understand how this study is going to get us there, but I think it's important for us to understand. But I think it's important information for us to understand that we're not accomplishing this now anyway. And I think that's kind of where Michael's getting at, is the premise upon which we object to the premise upon which it could be said that future members should not pay for the shortfall is a premise that we violate all the time right now with the way in which this system works. And I think that's basically what this study would demonstrate. And while we still have that disagreement about theory, I think the information could be useful in us addressing that policy issue as to what kind of a system is this.
Jennifer?
Whenever there's an issue, there are always going to be different individuals and different organizations that perceive things from their own lens. So naturally, a new educator may think, I'm paying increased benefits. Someone that started working January 1st of this year is going to pay more and is going to get less in their retirement. It may be their perspective, right or wrong, actuarially, it may be their perspective that this is the case. But it doesn't mean it's going to be the perspective of everyone, nor does it mean necessarily it's the right or wrong perspective. It's simply different. So I did want to make that note. When a legislator introduces a bill, they introduce a bill for a multitude of reasons. I'm using this as an analogy because I went through about 150 bills yesterday, and they will introduce a bill because there's a policy issue that needs to be addressed, there's a fiscal issue that needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's because they want to raise an issue politically. When a member of this board requests information, it can be interpreted at the same way, or the same way. Well, I would urge caution when this board is considering issues such as this, because we have just gone through a very extreme exercise, and this exercise is still continuing. We've been going through discussions for a number of years and have got to the point where everyone is sitting around the table. This has not always been the case. If one member of the discussion chooses to begin to go in another direction, that can cause fragmentation. I can tell you that the perception, at least that the CTA has been interpreting from some of the discussions that have been made from some of the members of the board, is that there is an interest in more than merely gathering information, but there may be an interest in looking at either bringing up issues of considering reducing benefits, changing the kind of system that we have, closing the system, that are beyond the scope of what has been asked. Whether or not it's the intent, that is the perception, and that is the belief. And it's not only our organization, but it's causing more anxiety. If you're going to start from scratch and begin to go in completely new discussions, then it's important for the board to let the constituent groups know that you may choose to move in a different direction, because it does change the situation that we're in. And you're certainly able to move in whatever direction you feel is appropriate. But if you move in a direction that can lead to a perception, and I can already tell you the perception with things like this is you want to begin to ask questions that are going to begin to plant seeds within the legislature or other areas on either closing the plan, moving to a 401k plan, reducing benefits, which is not, in our interpretation, the purview. Now, I can tell you the legislature and the governor's office is absolutely aware that they are the guarantors of the plan. Perhaps the new members of the legislature, they're going to need to be educated. But as an institution, not only are they aware, but they're also aware of the ramifications that they have continued to kick the can down the road over the past decade, which has been exacerbating and will continue to exacerbate the problem. For example, the budget was introduced today, and there is not a plan to solve the unfunded. It was not completely unexpected, but that is done with an understanding that that's going to continue to exacerbate the situation. But what I would urge you is caution, but to ask the question, are you intending to start from scratch? Are you intending to gather data that's going to change where this is going? Because that is the perception that I'm having now. If you're wanting to begin to gather new information, is that it could change the philosophy of discussions. So I would encourage you to let members of the public and constituency groups know if that is your intent, because we may choose to go to our friends in the legislature and perhaps encourage a new resolution to try to get clarity, because at the end of the day, it was the constituent groups that made sure that this resolution passed. And the constituent groups worked very hard to get this passed, because it was not something that was going to happen, because it was not something that the governor's office wished to include in AB 340. So we are primary stakeholders in regard to what you've been asked to do, and if we need to get clarification, we'd be happy to do that. But I'm getting the perception, and we've been getting the perception organizationally, that you may wish to move in a different direction, and we need to know what that is, because that's going to change where we move in the future.
May I respond? You asked a policy,
Sure.
you asked if there's an intent, and I'm the one introducing this. So let me be very clear. I am a firm supporter of defined benefit plans generally. I am a firm supporter of this plan. There is no intent whatsoever behind this request to change the direction, move it to a 401k, move it to a defined contribution, none of that. Categorically, my first job the reason I know of this structure at all is because my first job out of law school was at the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. I am a firm believer in defined benefit plans. I know what they do, I know how they work, and I know that they are the best plans out there. And I would want to do nothing to abrogate the benefits that this plan provides for the teachers who are members of this plan. I believe that this template that I'm requesting would enhance our ability to further the goals of this plan, nothing more. And if it turns out that the information that I've requested is useless, then we won't use it. But that is the only reason I'm asking for it, because in thinking this through, again, as I said in my introduction, in my mind, it's like using an MRI as opposed to an X-ray to examine what's going on. And it may be that the MRI doesn't provide any more information than the X-ray already provided, in which case we shouldn't be using it, and it's fine. but I think it will provide more useful information. But no, there is no intent behind my request, and this is not a request of the board. This is my request that I hope that the board supports. But there is no intent, no political intent whatsoever to move in any other direction.
Andrea, can I go to Nick first, seeing that we've had him kind of on the sideline for a while?
It's a lot of interesting discussion. Like when I first came down here, I started writing down some notes, and I think really Rich was the one who really kind of hit on a lot of my concerns. And obviously Michael and I have talked about this, and I'm going to break the stereotype, but as an actuary, I'm not necessarily in favor of more numbers. And that was my concern. So my question was really, you know, how would we do anything different? And, you know, Michael kind of, you know, has spoke to what he'd see coming out of this. And just to kind of, I mean, this is how I sort of perceive this is what we do is we track the members over time, you know, theoretically take, you know, each member, we do eventually, we put them in groups, but, you know, kind of track each member and how much they contributed and how much been contributed on their behalf in the system, and kind of look at where they are right now and, you know, how the contributions will come in to them, and sort of have an individual funded ratio. And it's like you would receive this much assets, and then, but do it on a group basis. And you would find out, obviously, that some groups, you know, the retirees might have a better funded ratio depending on, you know, when they were in the system and how much they earned. You know, that group, there may have been more contributions collected or less. And this kind of gets to Michael's point where, I mean, where it might be interesting is what you would see. I mean, if theoretically we got more contributions coming in and we took this, you know, 5 years, 10 years down the road, if we earned our 7.5%, you'd find that the future members have more assets allocated on their behalf than the liabilities they've earned. And that really gets to the point, which is, you know, those we need more contributions coming in to fund the benefits. There's an existing unfunded amount, and you need to get it from somewhere, and however you allocate it doesn't matter, but you need to get that money coming in. And yeah, there's going to be a perception, and that's why I think it's kind of a slippery slope, which Jennifer kind of talked about, when you start directly allocating these assets. And then just, I guess my one other concern I would have is just as far as we don't have information on everybody, so we're going to sort of have to do some approximations. And obviously, going back 100 years, you know, we're not going to have all the information. So to take all the members forward and all the assets forward, we kind of need to, you know, we're going to have to do some approximations. And to the extent that might distort a little bit. Just for example, you take the current retiree group. Well, that group is still living. Well, when we do our calculations, we know that people retire at a certain age, and then they're going to, you know, live, and some are going to die as they go along the ways. Well, we need those people to die so that, yeah. I mean, now I'm with the actuary stereotype, but we do need a certain amount of people to die to keep our projections to be online. Now, if we just look at the people who are still living, well, that's going to kind of distort our results, because there will be people who've died along the way where we got what we call an actual gain, and we would have just had some extra contributions. So if you just look at like that one group in isolation, you might say, well, we don't have enough money in for them, but the reality is that there was this other group that we actually got some gains on that would offset the, so we'd probably want to do some approximations to not distort it, but it would be a tricky process. So although I think there may be some, it could possibly come up with some interesting results, but I'm just concerned as to what value do we get out of it, and, you know, what we would do, if anything, if we did find some value.
Oh, there we go. Well, I'm glad that you brought up the analogy of the MRI, because one of the reasons we have inflated healthcare costs in this country is unnecessary tests being ordered. I feel that if we were in a different position, if we were looking right now at a pay-as-you-go system for our entire system, if we were in dire straits, not taking the steps that we are taking right now, we might find ourselves needing this sort of study, and it would be at the request of the guarantor, and perhaps they would be paying for it themselves. But we're not there, and I believe that it's unnecessary at this point.
Rich?
This is a little pickle for me, because there's a piece of me that philosophically says if Michael wants a piece of information, and it's not an outrageous request, and it doesn't cost us too much money, that even if I don't think it's very useful, which I don't, that there's a piece of me that thinks he ought to have it. And I was thinking about this while we were talking. Okay, I'm 65 years old, right? Not in this system, but in the other system, 2 years ago, I was eligible to retire at full benefits. Every year I work for the state, you could argue, and I'm getting older, right? Every year I work for the state, you could argue I pay into the system every year. You could argue I'm pouring that money into a rat hole because I'll never get it back. Okay? I get, a little seniority, but it's not nearly enough as much as I'm putting in, more than likely. And I'm probably going to work for the state for at least 2 more and maybe 6 more years. Right? So if we're going to look for people that ought to be able to get out at a certain point, not have to pay any more into the system, you sign me up. Right? I'm working for the benefit of everybody else in the system, not me. And so are we going to go to that system, right, where we're going to do that? I don't see the point. It's part of the problem, Michael, is I just don't see the point of starting to do that because we're not going to move. In fact, we're not going to move there. I don't know that we get any information that helps us. There's lots of ways to start slicing that pie up. And if we're going to start slicing it up, first place we ought to slice it is to my benefit. I'm good with that. Let's slice it so that I can be a winner in that team. But I hate the notion of saying you want something that's not totally out, that we shouldn't provide that to you. I have to tell you, I feel at the end of the day, not going to do much for me.
See, I think maybe I'm reading something into Michael's request, but I think Michael's saying exactly the opposite. He's saying we're already doing that. In other words, we've already got a system where different people make different contributions, and to say that we shouldn't have new employees pay for existing employees is inconsistent with the fact that already we have some employees paying for other employees. That's just the way this system works. And I think you agree that that's the way the system should work. That's the only way that a DB program does work. And so this has, I think, been a useful conversation in terms of that discussion. I'm not sure myself what we would do with the information. I also kind of feel like if Michael wants the information, I'm supportive of the information. But I think the theoretical discussion is I never want us to get to the point where we say, well, the members aren't all in this together. They are all in this together. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a DB program. That's just the nature of a DB program. So, and unfortunately, I have to leave in about 5 minutes. But
I have exhausted the list. I've kind of waited to weigh in. And Michael, I understand, and I don't like operating in a data-free zone either. And I have a tendency to believe that the more information that we can get, the better our decision-making is. My greatest concern is that we commission this and we get the information back and we don't think it's useful and we don't want to use it for anything. But the reality is we live as a board in a very public setting, and that information would not come back to us in a closed setting. It would come back to us in an open setting, which means that data is no longer ours. And my greatest concern is that while we might not think it's useful, somebody else might think it's useful, and somebody might use that information that wouldn't be in our best interest. So that is a fear that I thought that I needed to express. Because we have exhausted the list, the point we are now is we need to have someone make a motion because we aren't at consensus. So I would entertain a motion. So Michael has moved that we commission the study with Milliman. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we'll go to a vote. We'll go with a voice vote. If there is some discrepancy, the board is more than has the opportunity to ask for a show of hands, a roll call. I just want to make sure, because we aren't a consensus, that we satisfy what we need coming out of the vote. So y'all ready? All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. The motion fails. All righty. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate you bringing it before us. Back to the agenda. We have consent agenda. We have the minutes, board education requests, and contracts requiring approval. I would like to pull the minutes. Is there anyone that would like to pull any of the other two?
I just want to be added.
Yeah, I'll make sure before we go there, I do need to add Paul to the RFK Compass West Coast Conference, please. And Mary, are you here? Oh, we did. Oh, Paul. Yes, Paul. So it'd be Michael, Pedro, and Paul. Okay. So if you could add him to that, please. Alrighty. Terry? Yep. Let's add Terry to that also. It's in his hometown. There you go. Alrighty. Mary, you have both of those? Yes. Alrighty, thank you. So let's go with a motion to approve B and C, please. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All in favor say aye. All opposed, nay. The motion passes. So if I've had a conversation with Brian about the minutes, and if you go to the section, let me get there myself. That's item 3A. That's contracts. That's travel. I'm sorry, guys, I'm trying to get there. Let me just go here. In the minutes under item 3, where we had the discussion before about changing the minutes that we were approving for the meeting prior to this, there was a motion to reflect that Pedro, Michael, and Paul had voted not to adopt the staff recommendation, but the motion in these minutes don't reflect that. So I would like to, Brian and I've talked about it, we are going to amend these minutes. We can vote to amend them so that this actual motion reflects that, and then Brian will bring us back these minutes for approval. Does that sound okay to everyone?
I would appreciate that, Madam Chair, because that wasn't one of the raised the issue. Frankly, when I read it, I was a little bit frustrated.
Right, and it doesn't say that we had corrected the minutes as to how we corrected them, and I think it does need to reflect that. Alrighty, so with that amendment, I'd entertain a motion. It's been moved and seconded to approve our minutes as amended then. All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay. That has been approved. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to speak? Alrighty, then, do you have anything else for us? Oh, Jack, you wanted to talk about February.
Well, I'm just going to take you forward the next 3 months, just so you can kind of manage your calendars, carefully. For February, as I said, internally the agendas are due next week, and Dana and Harry approved the meeting schedule yesterday. So just to kind of get for your own time, February is February 6th through 8th. That's a Wednesday through Friday. On the Wednesday, we were having the appeals committee and audits. They would meet sequentially, not concurrently, because one of the appeals is an audit issue. So we need the staff to move through both committees. So we would have the appeals committee about 1:30, and audits I think is 3:30. And then on the next day, because of some scheduling issues, we are going to have the investment committee the next day, even though normally we like to do it on the third day. Investments would start the day at 9 o'clock, and Chris is thinking you would go till about 2 or 2:30, but you do have some flexibility there if you go longer, so you don't need to feel too tight. Depending upon when you end, we would have your ethics training, which we had moved forward from an earlier board meeting. We need to catch up on that with our legal staff. And then the final item of the day would be the compensation committee. And I just want to flag that for you, if you're not on the compensation committee, but remember we had discussion last time, but you have interest in that issue, which is defining the labor market for the staff, it'd be great. If you attend the committee meeting, all the materials will be just in the handouts ahead of time. The consultant's PowerPoint will be there for you when you get your board book, so everyone can see the consultant's thinking and recommendation. But just again, to set expectations, whatever the committee decides is ultimately a recommendation to the board, and then the board would need to sift through that motion on Friday. And if you have any extra time on that day, you may not, but if you did, you could pull in a few board items that aren't substantive just to kind of finish the day before your evening dinner. And then on the third day, I just want to highlight you have 3 items of substance in the board meeting itself. That's Friday. The first item would be this, continuation of finalization of your thinking on the funding report. So that's the big enchilada. Number 2 is the first draft of an indemnification policy. That was a piece we had pulled out of the insurance issue for the board about having your own board policy around indemnification of board members. So Ian is drafting that piece with Brian, and they'll both be presenting that to you on that Friday. And then the third item is the first time we're presenting to you our management's view of the high risks of the organization and how we're reviewing those and monitoring those using the template that Chris Ford, remember Chris Ford? That Chris Ford developed with you at the workshop. So we worked all this week on it, the executive staff kind of populating that template. So we want to get your feel for that. So that's kind of the meat of your February agenda. March, month of rest. We all take a month of rest. The only thing that could happen, but we're not expecting it, would be if Sharon needs any legislative committee to take any position. So we want to just keep that out in our minds. April, we would return back to your traditional 3-day schedule, which is the 10th through the 12th. And then I did want to make sure May is a month that you hold, again, a tentative date. We are planning on having the May meeting. It's May 2nd. Chris Elliman is planning on using half the day for your interviews of your primary investment consultant RFP, right, Chris? Did you have other business or just that half? So let's kind of hold our mind if things are happening at the legislature, or Sharon, if you need a legislative committee, you might well that month. You know, that you could fill out the rest of the day in May with that. So we'll kind of keep half day open for business from other committees. So hopefully that helps. That's the next 3 months. That's all I had.
So Jack, when would we know for sure if we needed to have that March meeting?
There's nothing here at all to indicate. I mean, you've caught each committee up, so no board
Okay.
members indicated.
Well, no,
The only thing would be
you
Sharon
mentioned
if,
something about legislation.
yeah, as
Talk-
it
talk
looks
to me.
today, we don't think there's anything that soon. Yeah. Or another, well, the dates were holding.
You can just, yeah, you can just sort of, I mean, the committee itself can meet whenever the committee's ready to meet without having the board.
It doesn't
meet.
necessarily need to be that day. It could
Well,
be-
we're all holding it though, but yeah. But
Well, that's kind of where I'm going. When would we know
I think
for
it-
sure we're not going
To
to
be
use
honest
it,
with you,
so
it's
we can free it up?
extraordinarily unlikely to be anything for the Ledge Committee to do at that
Okay.
point in March.
yeah, so that's what I really
So
was
that
saying.
we have better odds of actually having a free March if we're on the
Yeah,
March committee.
I think you need a day, we need a day of rest, yes. Yeah. Does that feel okay for the next 4 months then? Okay, and then, of course, if there's any breaking news on any of these funding fronts, we'll fit that in. Great, thanks that you've, this has been a very good discussion. I thought there was a better place for this than upstairs too, that with the microphones here and the better space, this was better than upstairs if you ever want to return to this format.
We are adjourned then. Thank you.